Hi, thanks for joining us on the Odgers-Berndtson One Question Media Series. I'm Jules McKean. I run the media practice for Odgers-Berndtson Executive Search out of London. And today I'm really delighted to be joined by Jane Turton, who is the Chief Exec Officer, as if she needed any introduction, of All3Media. Thanks for joining us, Jane.
Hi, hello.
So as I said, Jane is CEO of All3Media, and she's responsible for setting and implementing the group's global strategy. She became CEO in 2015 and has built All3Media, which is jointly owned by Discovery Communications and Liberty Global, into an international network of more than 30 award-winning independent production, distribution and digital media companies, producing content for broadcasters and digital platforms globally. All3Media's International, the group's distribution division, sells a catalogue of pretty staggering 15,000 hours of content across all genres to more than 1,000 broadcasters and platforms worldwide, and has consistently been voted the UK's best distributor in an annual peer poll. You probably will recognise many of the things that they produce, from Fleabag to Gogglebox to Coleman Wife, Hollyoaks, Three Identical Strangers and Gordon Ramsay. And Jane joined All3Media in 2008 as Deputy COO, becoming COO in 2011. She's held the positions of Director of Commercial and Business Affairs and Director of Business Affairs at ITV Studios and then ITV Network, as well as various roles at Granada Television, United Productions and Meridian Broadcasting. She is the chair of the Royal Television Society and sits on the Edinburgh TV Festival Board, which is quite right for somebody with so many links to Fife. And I'd just like to throw it out there, Jane. We've had a crazy year or so in this industry and in the world. What, if anything, do you think this industry has learned, our industry has learned from the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jules. Look, we've learned a lot. I think we've learned a lot of things. We've learned the things that people will tell you about frequently around resilience. I think the depth of the talent base, the quality of the people in the sector has really shone through. So I think all of that stuff people talk about a lot. I won't labour those points, but I think there's no doubt we have learned quite a lot about the depth and quality of the talent in television. But I think some of the other bits we've learned are perhaps a bit softer, and therefore people talk about less. We've become pretty critical in managing a business remotely, and that's about the relationships we have. It's about communication. I think it's about a lot about leadership. It's about clarity. It's about support. You know, we've had to, haven't we, adapt pretty quickly in many respects, personally and professionally. And to do that, we've needed a lot of support. And some people have struggled. Some people have found it more difficult than others. And we've discovered as a business, and I'm sure this is true of many businesses, that our role is more than just employment. It's become quite an important support, a pillar that, you know, that people can rely on in their lives. So I think that, which sounds soft, doesn't it, in some respects, has actually turned out to be a pretty concrete, hard thing, maybe using my pillow metaphor, and something that is just absolutely critical if you're going to run a successful business through a period of basically crisis. So that's a big thing I think we've learned. I think we've learned a lot about the people we work with and how to support them during a period of massive disruption.
And you must have had to change all of the actual technical ways in which you run your business on the ground, the production, overnight. So were you trying to balance out how you functionally make all of those shifts at the same time as how you keep your talent engaged and happy and, you know, mentally in the right space? That's too big. You know, a lot of businesses only had to do the latter, whereas in fact you've had to do a huge business restructure in terms of how you operate at the same time.
Well, no, look, in terms of sort of change management, it's had every element, hasn't it? So you're absolutely right. The sort of logistics dramatically different. The risk profile changed hugely. And risk, you know, business ultimately is about risk and return, and suddenly risk just was very different, much bigger risk than we'd ever known before. You know, could we reliably send people out on location? How did we do that? What sort of protocols were necessary? How did we shoot Gogglebox, for example, that went on all the way through the lockdowns, plural. The answer is we rigged the houses, we didn't send people in, but we had to do all of that change immediately to keep the show on air. Editing remotely. So people who had been used to very much a sort of team environment suddenly became, home operators working on their own. So, that not only does that change the logistics of it, which it did fundamentally, but it also changes their whole sort of pattern of behaviour. Yeah. And as I said earlier, the whole way that they worked was very different. They didn't necessarily have the same support, etc., etc. So I think, you're absolutely right. Massive change in the way we work, operational, logistical, risks, as I mentioned, people's attitudes to work. Were they willing to do things that they were worried about? They were anxious. They were more gung-ho. It's not necessarily that one is actually easier than the other. Sometimes gung-ho is a problem as well. You've got to factor in this. So I think a lot of it was pretty dramatic, the change, but we got through it, and I'm very proud to say that most of our shows are now back up. I mean, the ones that obviously are more difficult, the ones that involve a lot of international travel, and the ones where you've got large audience, just you have to, like sport, is still different, and getting back, but much more slowly. So I think we did an extraordinary job of keeping people, watching television, slightly different and maybe some gaps in schedules, but nonetheless, we continued through this period and continued to make programs, which is pretty impressive given the constraint.
And it does feel, doesn't it, that there was purpose at work seems to have come through as something that is even more important to people in face of a huge crisis. What if I'm going to sit in Zoom for 13 hours a day, or if I'm going to go out and try and figure out how to do this production, I need to feel a core purpose. And I know that seems to be what people say about the way that you lead, Jane, and you're leading from the front. And do you feel like people really looked to you as the person to sort of set the agenda and to kind of feel that you're actually creating and producing entertainment for the nation that's going to actually keep people out there watching it in a much better frame of mind than if they didn't have that? There is a certain purpose about that entertainment, isn't there?
I think the purpose thing does help. You're absolutely right. This is not a frivolous activity. It's a real, I always call it a manufacturing business. People look at me and think that's a strange way to describe television, because it has that sort of component of art, which meets commerce, which meets production, manufacturing. But I think you're right. I think the sort of producing of programs suddenly became more important from a societal perspective. I think the broadcasters felt that very much as well. If you look at the BBC during this period, I think it fulfilled the most phenomenal role as a very reliable, high quality, as you would expect, partner to the British population for education, for entertainment, news, etc. And I'm sure the same applies to ITV, to the PSB generally, but also actually to the OTT players, the Netflixes and Amazon Prime, Apples. As a supplier to them, a massive supplier to these businesses, we saw that they responded really constructively and supportively to that production sector that was going on risk to supply them. So I think, again, you said earlier, what did we learn? We learned good partners are really good partners. The good partner thing is not loosey-goosey, unimportant. This is critical most of the time, but even more so when stuff gets a bit tough. So I think you're right. I think the societal role of television and broadcasting and production and that whole alchemy that is about producing a line of duty, which sadly isn't us. It's not a world show. Or a Call a Midwife, which is us, or a Hollyoaks, or a Gogglebox, or whatever, or some of those amazing shows we're now so proud of having in the group through Silverback, which was this natural history business before. These things just became more important.
I must say, I mustn't be the only person who spent lockdown wondering what the city keys were going to say next that was going to compare with my belief system of what was being said by the government on Gogglebox. It was so interesting as a sort of social, snapshot in time, what the nation's response was to BBC alerts or what was being happening.
I think it's a fabulous program, isn't it? You're absolutely right. I mean, the quality, the insight, it's entertaining, but it's also fascinating listening to those clever, interesting people and their opinions. I agree.
It's almost like it could. I always thought of it as the week junior for popular culture, the week for popular culture, but I almost wonder whether it's going to be a real sort of social snapshot like 7 Up was eventually in this period of time. Still, there's different families. And sort of that takes me on to sort of, I know with your role at the RTS, just briefly to touch on, I know that regions and nations is critically important to what your drive and actually the society's drive and kind of opening up talent. Do you feel that, is there something about what's happened with forcing people to work from home that could in some ways help drive a bit more diversity geographically outside of the bigger cities, kind of to enable people to enter the world of television, which has always been a little bit closeted perhaps around certain big cities?
Yeah, well, I hope so. I mean, I really do. I think you're putting your finger on it. It's exactly the point, isn't it? So, the nations and regions of it is really partly about portrayal and partly about inclusivity in the workplace. How on earth do we broaden out as a sector in terms of all types of diversity, be it ethnicity, be it physical ability, disability, be it socio-economic, actually is a big one, I think, for us in television. And I think part of the answer to that is, broadening out the commissioning base, pushing out of London more, and making sure that where possible, and it isn't going to be a case that every single town in the country will have a production company, but where possible we can at least improve representation and opportunity, and not just entry level all the way through. So you've got to persuade people there's a career path, and to do that is very different from just one show every so often coming out of Newcastle. So you've got to, I think, have proper training, proper access to the roles, proper long-term career trajectory, and it has to be economically sensible to boot. So it's not an easy task. There's time and a lot of effort, and some risk taking on behalf of employers and commissioners. But I think 100%, I think you're right. It's got to be done, and it's long overdue.
Yes, one would hope that there certainly seems to be reported a sort of democratization of the screen. That means that it's not just the people in front of you physically in the office that one goes to for advice, that you actually are just as likely to then pick up the phone to someone in another country on your extended team.
I think there's a bit of that. I think you're right. I think the new platforms have no respect for geography, which I think is a positive, actually.
Yes.
So you're watching something in multiple different languages, aren't you? Multiple different types of cast and crew and writing and et cetera, on these new platforms, which again, I think is broadening out people's appetites and taste, and that must be good, because again, that will create a demand that's a slightly more diverse and inclusive type of programming, I think. I mean, look, it's still a work in progress, isn't it, all of this? But I think we've got reason to be optimistic that many of these moves are moving in the right direction, but we do need to keep on it. It's not going to happen on its own. It will take effort. I think it's an interesting time for that. And I think that if you talk to people like YouTube, they will say to you as well, to your democratization point, they will say, of course, what they do is because they have no sort of barrier to access, they have allowed a whole generation of people growing up to believe that if they produce something decent, they can get it out in front of an audience and it will be viewed. And I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? So normal, obstacle that is the commission decision, the green light, and then into production, that's gone in that world.
Yes.
You still have to be viewed, and it still has to be good. I still believe that, we're not watching cats and skateboards anymore. We're way beyond that. We're now into very high quality. But some of the barriers have been broken down. So that might be good. And I think that's partly courtesy of social media, and partly just a generation that has no respect for this sort of old model. which is
gatekeepers. They've got rid of some of the gatekeepers.
Yeah, the gatekeepers. I mean, it's always a big debate, isn't it? The gatekeeper, and then weirdly, the models that start off with no gatekeepers then employ them and go back. Yeah. They all revert ultimately back to the B2B model that we all knew. You think questions, and then up comes the next one and recreates.
Yes, exactly. It's that. I think it's going to be fascinating because there's that sort of dynamic happening on TikTok now as well, and then it's going back in. The things that starting on TikTok are going back into the mainstream. The music is going into Fortnite, and it's making its way back around in this wonderful circle. It's
disruption is a permanent phenomenon, isn't it? In telly, and the sort of dynamism of it, I think, is very healthy.
Yeah. Jane, that is lots for us to think about there. Let's hope that our industry has not only learned something, but will continue to bed in some of the learnings over the next few years and don't just throw it all out again. And I'm sure under your leadership, that certainly won't happen at All3Media. And thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Jules.